And it takes us back to an incident that, to my knowledge, has never been commemorated by the U.S. government. We get a lot of commemorations, let's say, of a war ending. You know, it's victory over Europe in 1945. People want to commemorate that. Or it's the bombing of Pearl Harbor. People want to remember that because of all those people who died in that attack. But there are some events that are simply never commemorated. And one of them involves something that Thomas Jefferson did in 1798. It's never been commemorated. And my suspicion is because the government is afraid if they commemorate this, they might be giving us some ideas. What was Thomas Jefferson up to in 1798? Well, Jefferson was the vice president, which is not a particularly powerful office, or I suppose it can be. I think Dick Cheney has made it more powerful than it has been. But for Thomas Jefferson, there was really not much to do all day. Well, it so happens that in that year, because the U.S. was sort of and sort of not at war with France. In fact, it was so sort of and sort of not at war with France that the war is known as the Quazy War with France. We can't even really make up our minds. Are we at war with France or not? But it was enough of a war footing that the country was on that President John Adams would be found in public with a sword by his side as an indication of the fact that we are on a kind of a military footing. And the Congress in 1798 passed a series of laws, and one of them, in effect, made it a criminal offense to criticize the U.S. government too harshly. You could actually be thrown in jail or fined for saying unkind words. For example, there was one poor soul who just simply said offhandedly, "I hope the presidential saluting cannon fires a cannonball right into the behind of President John Adams," and that guy was fined $100 because you're not allowed to do that. There were newspaper editors who found themselves being sent to jail because they said unkind things about the U.S. government. Well, what's interesting about all this is, for one thing, is that at that time there were two political parties. There were the Federalists. John Adams was a Federalist. And there were the Republicans, not the same Republicans as today. Thomas Jefferson belonged to that party. And it's interesting that when you read this law, the law is obviously designed to make it illegal to criticize the Federalist Party, because it says you can't criticize the President, he belongs to the Federalists, can't criticize the Congress, which has a preponderance of Federalists, and it goes on and on. But it doesn't say anything about the Vice President, who happened to be a Republican. You can say anything you want to about him, no law against that. So it was a little bit obvious that this was aimed at Jefferson's party. Jefferson didn't take too kindly to this. And Jefferson thought, what do we do? The federal government is obviously violating the freedom of speech here. You should be able to wish that cannonball thing and not have to pay a fine. So what do we do? And Jefferson, it's interesting what he did not do. He did not say, well, it was fun having a free society for 10 years, but I guess we may as well give up on it. Or this Constitution worked out okay for a while, but I guess it's going into the can. He didn't do anything like that. He didn't say we should just give in or we should forget about it. He said we need to fight against this. But how do we fight against this? Do we wait 2 years for another presidential election? In 2 years, we might all be in jail. You know, we can't wait 2 years. What do? Do we all sign petitions to the government? Oh, please, please take this terrible law away? That's pathetic. You know, nothing's going to come of that. What other things can we do? So we think of all the different things we could do. And he didn't say, by the way, let's go to the Supreme Court and see what they say. Because, number one, the Supreme Court is full of people who have been appointed by the Federalist Party. So they favor this. So the Supreme Court is not any help to you. Also, Jefferson didn't like this idea that we should go to the Supreme Court and that the Supreme Court is made up of these demigods who are all-knowing and who have their black robes and they go into some closed room and they decide what our Constitution means and then they come out and tell us. He thought that was very dangerous. He didn't want the Supreme Court to have that kind of power. So what did he decide to do instead? Jefferson proposed an extremely radical-sounding solution. Jefferson said that each state of the United States should have the power to be able to decide if it believed the U.S. government had violated the Constitution, had done something that clearly was not allowed under the Constitution. The states should have the right to not only to say that that had happened, but the states should also have the right to say, we are not going to enforce that law. We're not going to enforce your anti-free speech law in this state, in Virginia or in Kentucky. We're not going to enforce it there. That was the proposal that Jefferson developed. And he said, now this may sound crazy. You know, I mean, this may sound crazy that every state could have the power to say to the federal government, we're not going to enforce your stinking law. But Jefferson's answer was, well, what better solution do you have? What other solution is there? There really isn't any other solution. If we don't do this, we're just going to encourage the federal government to do more things if we don't act right now. So that was Jefferson's solution. It was called nullification. If the federal government comes up with a rotten law that violates the Constitution, we nullify it in each of the states. Each state gets to decide if it wants to nullify it. Because Jefferson says, look, we got two parties here. We got the federal government and we got the states. And we can't say that the Constitution can be interpreted only by the federal government and not by the states. Because nobody would ever enter into a contract where only the other side gets to interpret what it means. I would not go up to Mark Thornton and say, Mark, I'm going to give you $10 to mow my lawn, but only you get to interpret what that means. Because that may mean that 30 years down the line, he still hasn't mowed my lawn, and he could come up to me and say, well, my understanding was that in 50 years' time I mow your lawn, and you give me the $10 now. And I would probably say, well, that's not the way I interpreted it. But suppose only I could interpret it. Maybe my view would be, Thornton mows my lawn now, and I pay him in 50 years. I mean, what happens when only one side gets to interpret what a contract means? You're going to interpret that contract in a way that benefits you. And Jefferson said the same thing would go for the federal government. If only they get to interpret the Constitution, well, what a surprise. They're going to interpret it to mean the federal government gets to do whatever it wants. If the states can't stand up and resist that, well, we have no right to be surprised when, over time, the federal government gets all the power and the states are destroyed. So Jefferson and James Madison together anonymously drafted a couple of documents, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798. Virginia and Kentucky, in their state legislatures, passed these documents that declared that not only do we protest this anti-free speech law, but we also say that the states can resist it. They can say, we absolutely refuse to obey this because it violates the Constitution. And if it violates the Constitution, then it is no law at all. Now, when I started this little discussion, I noted that these documents that basically said the states can resist, these documents have never been commemorated. In 1998, did Bill Clinton say, hey, everybody, let's all get together and commemorate the 200th anniversary of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions? He would have died 1,000 deaths before doing such a thing. Because then people might think, well, gee, can we do that now? Can we do that now? We don't want anybody thinking that. Oh, heavens no, we can't have that come up again. So therefore, this episode is either passed over or barely mentioned or misinterpreted or whatever. But it was an essential idea. In fact, it was so essential that for decades after that, people referred to these ideas as the principles of 98, referring to the year 1798. The idea that the federal government has only a few powers that the states gave to it. And then any other powers rest with the states. And if the states believe the federal government has gone beyond what it's allowed to do, then those states can refuse to obey those laws. That became known as the Principles of 98. And they remained alive for years and years after that. The New England states referred to the Principles of 98 over and over and over again. So this is a major part of American history and a central building block in the tradition of American liberty that has just been totally forgotten. I mean, how often is this brought up? Never.